Right now, Ryan Ruocco, one of the voices of ESPN television. We'll talk a little Sixers, Raptors, Celtics, Bucks. He also calls some Brooklyn Nets games as well, so we can get his thoughts on what happened in that series as the Sixers win 4-1. But a new challenge, Ryan. This Raptors team, Brett Brown said it the other night, the math has not been flattering, just 3-21 in the Brett Brown era. But he thinks those numbers should go out the window because this is a new Sixer roster. They have not matched up since the Tobias Harris trade. But this one here should be interesting. Did you see anything different about the Sixers in the matchup against the Nets that should make us maybe say, hey, maybe I think more of this Sixer team than I did with them before they entered the playoffs?
Not really. I thought pretty highly of the Sixers and what they were capable of heading into the playoffs. And, I think that obviously there was a strong disparity in top-end talent between Philadelphia and Brooklyn. So I was a little surprised initially with how game one went. But, the Sixers obviously did a nice job handling their business for the most part of the next four games. I think if there was something on the positive that surprised me for Philadelphia from that first round, it was they got some significant bench contributions that are going to be important moving forward, whether if you think about, the moment Mike Scott had in game 4 or, what Boban did throughout the series, that's going to be important for them to get little bits of confidence there because we know that starting five fits so well together and is so dominant with such great positional size that's going to be where the majority of their minutes lie. But I thought it was encouraging for them, for their bench to have just a couple moments here and there that made you think, okay, can they do that in another series as well, especially when Toronto is a team that feels very comfortable with their first few guys coming off the bench. But I think that if there was something from the starting five that I took away that was interesting to me was Philadelphia was still able to play a dominant brand of basketball at times in that first round without even getting a huge contribution from Jimmy Butler. And I thought at this time of year, they may need more from Butler in order to look like the juggernaut we saw at times during the regular season. I thought they'd need more from Butler, but I thought it might be encouraging for them that, hey, Butler, we know he can fit his style to the playoffs. I mean, he's a guy who also has done it here. And you didn't necessarily have to get the absolute best out of him in that first round for you to still look like a dominant starting five.
Yeah, the one thing is, in the games that they've played in the past, Kawhi Leonard has really taken Ben Simmons out of games. I mean, he has been kind of the big bugaboo. But now the Sixers have a little bit of extra reinforcements here. I'm interested to see if Toronto still employs him 100% and on Ben Simmons and just says, hey, take him out, because essentially now you got Jimmy Butler and Tobias Harris, not to mention Joel Embiid, and that will be I think that will be a very interesting game plan to see how Toronto handles Ben Simmons in this series, who was a lot more aggressive after game one against the Nets.
Yeah, and he had some really great moments, and there are certain things Simmons can do that just make some point will need to get better. The focus still should be more on all the amazing things he can do, and he played some brilliant defense in that first round as well. And that's a part of his game that should not be ignored either. Just the positional size he has when he's out on the floor on the defensive end. And I agree, going back to what you were saying about with a 3-21 record and Brett Brown saying it's a different team. I mean, it is. To me, you have to throw that stuff more or less out the window for a couple of reasons. One, how much of that 3-21 was accumulated when the Sixers were tanking,
right.
And two, both of these teams have very different squads right now than they have at any other point over the last couple of years. Philadelphia, because of all the changes they made throughout the season and at the deadline, and Toronto, with Marc Gasol and obviously with a much different looking bench than what they relied on last year. And then also Kawhi Leonard, who was a part of the matchups this year, but obviously wasn't in the years before. So, I mean, I don't look at the history and think it's necessarily telling the story of what's to come between this group of personnel because we just haven't seen enough of it.
One of the voices of the NBA on ESPN television, Ryan Ruocco, joined us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Gasol was a Defensive Player of the Year. The numbers Embiid has had in his time against Memphis, the worst of any team, 14.5 points when he goes up against Memphis. You can make the argument that Toronto makes this trade with this matchup in mind, and if Embiid is limited at all, you wonder if the Sixers, can win this series, because obviously for them to get through this series, Embiid's going to have to be an MVP-esque player.
Yes, he does. Look, he's their best player. He's their most dominant force. He is a guy who, we saw in that game 4 against Brooklyn, right? Where, and Toronto's better suited to be able to defend on the interior against a guy like Embiid. But we saw where it was basically just give the ball to Joel, let him get out of the way, and all of a sudden a deficit that existed most of the game was gone because Embiid is just that brilliant on both ends of the floor, really. But in that case, offensively is where we were seeing it. So, I think what I saw just from calling game 1 between the Raptors and Magic, and something Chauncey Billups and I talked about, Marc Gasol at this stage is vulnerable in a pick and roll, right? If you're going to switch and you're going to get a smaller player on Marc Gasol, he is going to struggle in that matchup a little bit. And that's an area where he can have issues on the defensive end. But as we know, Philadelphia is not a big pick and roll team offensively. So are they going to have to try and get Gasol in some more of those situations in order to not allow Gasol to play to his strengths defensively? That's right. One of the things I'm going to be looking forward to watching this series.
Siakam, I'm sure you've seen him a couple times, at least in person. He's long, he's athletic. To me, he's kind of a wild card in this series on what does Philly do with him. You got your hands full with Kawhi Leonard, but this Siakam has turned into a real legit number 2 player, not to mention, Lowry had that bugaboo first game, and he's had a bad past, but he seems to have gotten past that at least these last couple of games against Orlando. But Siakam, to me, almost has elevated himself as the number 2 man on that team.
I agree with you. I think he is a total stud. Both ends, brings incredible energy. I thought showed poise throughout the first round. When his team needed him most, was able to come through, wasn't afraid to take big shots. And we've kind of been looking at Siakam as, wow, that guy's gotten so much better. He's such a great complementary piece now. But the way you just described is much more accurate. He's the number 2 dude on that team now, and that's a team with serious talent. Serge Ibaka had a very strong year, one of his best years in a long time. Marc Gasol has had an incredibly positive influence on everybody on that team. Kawhi Leonard had better numbers than when he finished 3rd for the MVP a couple seasons ago, his last healthy year with San Antonio. So to say Siakam is, and we know Kyle Lowry obviously is a multi-time All-Star, to say Siakam is definitively the second best player on that team is quite a compliment. And it's true at this juncture. He could shoot it. He could put it on the floor. He can create. He can go coast to coast. He could defend. He is a guy who I think this is a series where NBA fans who haven't watched the Raptors that closely, who have just kind of heard, oh, yeah, Siakam's a lot better, they're going to watch him and be like, oh, wait, no. The dude isn't just like a lot better. This dude is a difference maker. And I would not be surprised at all if at the end of this series the Raptors win, we're saying, wow, they won because of that guy, talking about Pascal Siakam.
Ryan Ruocco, ESPN, with us here on the Sports Bash. 19 ESPN analysts, 17 of them picked Raptors in this series. So it seems that a lot of NBA people think that the Raptors are clearly the better team. Maybe not clearly. A lot of them say 6 and 7, but it seems that consensusly Toronto's going to win this series. Do you think that Philly is closer to Toronto than many people believe they are? In other words, should it be more than 17 out of 19 thinking that Toronto's going to win this?
I think that you put Philly's starting 5, and it's about as good as any starting 5 in the NBA, right? Like, you could say that is the best starting 5 in the NBA now with the injury to DeMarcus Cousins out in Golden State. And, some people won't argue that. But I think there is a perception about the Sixers that they are a little combustible and their, personalities don't mesh perfectly, and that, you wonder how they're going to handle adversity against an opponent like Toronto. Now, they handled it really well against Brooklyn multiple times. And so I think that should quell some of the doubt in those situations. Like the way they lost game one and then with the cell phone on the bench and Embiid's injuries, like that really looked like it was tailored for, full implosion. And instead they go and win 4 straight in a variety of different fashions, right? Including one game without Embiid. So that showed me some mettle and that showed me some toughness. But I think people have more trust in what they're going to get out of Toronto. And that's why you see them, 17 out of 19 analysts picking them.
Which is odd, Ryan, because the Toronto team, the last couple of years, obviously they have new personnel, but they were always the team that had the 50 wins, the 60 wins, and couldn't get out of the second round. And now adding Kawhi Leonard has changed that perception. It
has. And it's Kawhi. Remember, Kawhi's postseason, he was having the year, Zaza hurt his ankle in the game one of the Western Conference Finals. Kawhi, up until that point, was having one of the great postseasons of all time. He was on his way to, if you want to go by like PER, he was in LeBron and Wilt Chamberlain territory for what he was doing in that playoffs. And so you're talking about a guy who is truly one of the absolute studs in our game and has handled these moments before. I mean, Kawhi Leonard has performed at his best on this stage over and over again in his career. That's a big difference for Toronto. It's not insignificant. And Danny Green, don't forget him too. He's another guy who we've seen perform at his best on this stage, another two-way player. Even a guy like Siakam, I know he's tied in a little bit to the Raptors' history of playoff failures, but not that significantly because his role is so much different than what it was over the last couple of seasons. And then you have an assistant who's now a head coach who maybe was looking at some things and thinking, hey, maybe I do this differently, maybe I wouldn't. Now he has the chance to, and Nick Nurse. I think that, the only real holdover from the context of what Toronto's been through in the playoffs over the last couple of years, the last 5 years, 6 years, is Kyle Lowry and the fan base. And what the Raptors showed us, because I was there doing game one, fan base was, oh, here we go again after they lost to Orlando. But what this group showed us was like, hey, we're a different group, we're a different team. And the way they came back in game two and the rest of that series, I think should put some of that fear to bed, because these guys don't carry the weight of the past failures, because for the most part, they just weren't here.
I agree with you 100%. Been saying it since October. They were my pick to get to the Eastern Conference, to the NBA Finals from the East, and I don't change that now. I think Toronto wins the series. Real quick, Boston-Milwaukee. Quick thought on that one, because Milwaukee was clearly the best team record-wise, stat-wise, and Boston couldn't get out of its own way, and now it seems like people are like, I think Boston can win this thing.
Well, Boston, we always knew, right? If they could get to a place where they're performing at their best, they would be a team that has as good a chance as any in the Eastern Conference. And it feels like they found comfort with their rotation. They found a Gordon Hayward who's been much more consistently productive over the last month, including this first-round series against Indiana. And we know they have defensive versatility and an outstanding head coach, plus a guy that you can give the ball to and he can just go get a bucket in Kyrie Irving. So I give Boston a real shot in this series. However, I do think people are underrating just how good Milwaukee is. We'll see about Brogdon and what they do or don't get out of him. But the Milwaukee Bucks are ridiculously deep, and they're dominant on both ends of the floor. And it's not just Giannis. People treat Brook Lopez like he's a role player. Brook Lopez is playing like a star. Eric Bledsoe's playing like a borderline all-star. Chris Middleton is an all-star. Brogdon's a 50-40-90 guy. Off the bench now, they've gotten so deep that Tony Snell, who was a big part of their rotation not that long ago, isn't even playing. They're really, really good. And anytime somebody says something about Mike Budenholzer and Leanne, well, you remember, though, in Atlanta, his teams didn't do that well in the playoffs, I laugh because I say, did you see the teams he had in the playoffs? Like, this group of Bucks is in a different stratosphere of top-tier talent than what Coach Bud had in Atlanta. So for me, I think Boston has a real shot because I think they're very good, they're deep, and they're incredibly well coached. But I think Milwaukee has been underrated every step of the way, and I think they should absolutely be favorites in the East.
Ryan Ruocco, one of the voices of NBA on ESPN, so I'll ask you a personal question here. If you got to pick one of these series to call exclusively, Sixers, Raptors, Bucks, Celtics, Warriors, Raptors, or Blazers, Spurs, Nuggets?
Well, I think you'd have to go with Warriors, Rockets, assuming that the Warriors beat the Clippers. And I think that, we still got to see that finished off because, hey, the Clippers continue to surprise and the Warriors have maybe a little bit more vulnerability than we've seen in the past. But I think that would have to be the series based on what we saw between them in the Western Conference Finals last year. But you know what, man? I gratefully, in all likelihood, will get a chance to call a game next weekend in the second round. And I can tell you that I legitimately look at every single one of those series and think, oh, man, I'd be so excited to call that. Yeah, you can't go wrong. You really can't go wrong.
Ryan Ruocco and the NBA playoffs are on ESPN. And, of course, you can listen to Sixers Raptors right here on 97.3 ESPN. Ryan, great stuff, man. Appreciate the time.
All right. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate you having me.